On the morning of March 29th, 2025, the air in Grand Rapids, Michigan carried the familiar chill of early spring. Parents bustled about, helping their teenagers gather backpacks, snacks, and jackets for what was supposed to be a memorable day. The Grand Rapids Civic Theatre had organized a college visit for its young performers, a chance to step outside the rehearsal halls and classrooms, to imagine futures filled with opportunity. For many of these students, the trip represented more than just a bus ride. It was a symbolic journey toward adulthood, independence, and dreams waiting to be realized. The charter bus stood waiting, its engine humming, its seats lined with anticipation. 11 students climbed aboard, joined by 4 adult chaperones. Laughter echoed through the aisles as friends compared schedules, whispered about auditions, and speculated about what college life might be like. The atmosphere was light, filled with the kind of optimism only teenagers can radiate. Parents waved goodbye, reassured by the sight of a professional driver at the wheel. After all, field trips are supposed to be safe. They are supposed to be routine. They are supposed to end with stories of discovery, not tragedy. Behind the wheel sat Angela Fitzgerald, a 45-year-old bus driver from Grand Rapids. To the students, she was simply the adult tasked with steering them down the highway. To the parents, she was a figure of trust, someone who had accepted responsibility for their children's safety. Fitzgerald herself likely saw the day as another assignment, another route, another paycheck. But beneath the surface of this ordinary trip lay hidden dangers that no one could see. The bus rolled onto I-96, a familiar artery of Michigan travel. The highway stretched ahead, bordered by fields and forests, a ribbon of asphalt connecting communities. Inside the bus, conversations flowed easily. Some students leaned against windows, earbuds in, lost in music. Others chatted animatedly, their voices rising above the hum of the engine. The adults monitored quietly, content to let the students enjoy their moment. Everything seemed normal. Everything seemed safe. Yet, in hindsight, the seeds of disaster had already been sown. Fitzgerald had taken Ativan, a prescription medication, the night before. Ativan is often prescribed for anxiety, but it can cause drowsiness, slowed reaction times, and impaired coordination. Alone, it might not have raised alarms. But toxicology reports would later reveal something more troubling. THC, the active ingredient in marijuana, was present in her system at the time of the crash. Whether Fitzgerald believed she was fit to drive or underestimated the effects, the reality was stark. She was not in full control. The juxtaposition is haunting. On one hand, a bus filled with young people brimming with hope, embarking on a journey meant to inspire. On the other, a driver whose body carried substances known to impair judgment and reaction. The collision of these two realities was inevitable, though no one aboard could have predicted it. Parents at home assumed their children were safe. Students assumed the adults had everything under control. Fitzgerald assumed she could handle the drive. Assumptions, however, can be deadly. As the bus moved steadily down I-96, the fragility of trust became clear. Every field trip, every commute, every journey relies on unseen bonds. Parents trusting schools, schools trusting drivers, drivers trusting themselves. When those bonds break, the consequences ripple outward, touching lives in ways that can never be undone. On that morning, the bond between trust and safety was already fraying, though no one yet realized it. The story of Angela Fitzgerald's case begins here, in the ordinary details of a school trip. It begins with laughter, with backpacks, with parents waving goodbye. It begins with a bus rolling down a highway, carrying dreams and responsibilities. And it begins with a driver whose body carried substances that would later become the centerpiece of a courtroom battle. The tragedy of March 29th, 2025, is not just about a crash. It is about the illusion of safety, the fragility of trust, and the devastating consequences when responsibility falters. This chapter sets the stage for everything that follows. It reminds us that disasters rarely announce themselves. They hide in the ordinary, waiting for a moment of weakness, a lapse in judgment, a collision of circumstances. For the students aboard that bus, the day began with promise. For their families, it began with reassurance. For Angela Fitzgerald, it began with responsibility. By the end of the day, all three would be shattered, replaced by pain, anger, and questions that may never be fully answered. The bus was moving steadily along Interstate 96, the highway stretching like a ribbon through Portland Township. For the students inside, the hum of the engine was background noise to their conversations, laughter, and daydreams. They were thinking about the college visit ahead, about futures that seemed wide open. The adults on board were relaxed, watching over the group, but confident that the trip was unfolding as planned. It was, in every sense, an ordinary school outing. Then, in a matter of seconds, ordinary turned into catastrophe. Witnesses later described the moment as sudden and violent. The charter bus, a massive vehicle designed to carry dozens safely, began to drift. At first, it may have seemed like a minor swerve, the kind of correction drivers make every day. But this was no small adjustment. The bus veered off the highway, its trajectory pulling it toward the guardrail. The sound of tires screeching against asphalt filled the air, followed by the sickening crunch of metal as the bus slammed into the barrier. Inside, chaos erupted. Students were thrown against seats, some hitting the floor, others colliding with each other. Screams pierced the air, mingling with the grinding of steel and the shattering of glass. For those on board, the world became a blur of motion, noise, and fear. In the space of a heartbeat, the safety they had taken for granted was gone. When the bus finally came to a halt, the silence was deafening. Then came the cries of pain, cries of confusion, cries for help. For students had sustained injuries, their bodies battered by the force of the crash. One student's injuries were catastrophic, so severe that doctors would later make the agonizing decision to amputate part of their foot. A young life, once filled with dreams of theater in college, was now forever altered. Emergency responders rushed to the scene. Sirens wailed as ambulances and police vehicles converged on the site. Paramedics worked quickly, assessing injuries, stabilizing patients, and preparing them for transport to hospitals. Parents, notified of the crash, raced to emergency rooms, their hearts pounding with fear. For them, the day had begun with reassurance, with the belief that their children were safe. Now they faced the unthinkable. Angela Fitzgerald, the driver, survived the crash. Shaken but conscious, she spoke with deputies. She insisted she hadn't consumed alcohol in months. She admitted to taking Ativan the night before, a prescription medication often used to treat anxiety. But toxicology reports would later reveal something more damning. THC, the active ingredient in marijuana, was present in her system at the time of the crash. The revelation raised immediate questions. How impaired had Fitzgerald been? Had her reaction times been slowed? Had her judgment been clouded? For investigators, the presence of THC was a critical piece of evidence, one that suggested the crash was not merely an accident, but the result of impaired driving. For the students, however, the questions were secondary to the reality of their injuries. One faced the lifelong consequences of amputation. Others endured broken bones, bruises, and emotional trauma. The crash had stolen their sense of safety, replacing it with fear and uncertainty. The community reeled. News of the crash spread quickly, sparking outrage and sorrow. Parents demanded answers. How could this happen on a school trip? How could a driver entrusted with children be impaired? The incident was more than a headline. It was a betrayal of trust, a reminder that safety is never guaranteed. In the days that followed, the crash became the subject of intense scrutiny. Investigators pieced together the timeline, examining Fitzgerald's actions, her statements, and the toxicology results. Prosecutors prepared charges, determined to hold her accountable. For the victims and their families, the legal proceedings were a painful reminder of what had been lost. The crash on I-96 was not just a collision of metal and asphalt. It was a collision of trust and negligence, of innocence and reality. It was a moment that changed lives forever, leaving scars that would never fully heal. For the students, the memory of that day would linger. The sound of the crash, the feeling of being thrown, the sight of friends injured, these were experiences that could not be erased. For their families, the fear and anguish of waiting in hospital corridors will remain etched in their minds. And for Angela Fitzgerald, the crash marked the beginning of a legal battle that would define her future. The tragedy of March 29th, 2025, is a reminder of how quickly life can change. One moment, a bus filled with laughter and anticipation. The next, a scene of chaos and pain. It is a reminder that safety is fragile, that trust can be broken, and that the consequences of negligence can be devastating. This chapter is the heart of the story, the moment when everything changed. It is the moment when a school trip became a nightmare, when dreams were replaced by trauma, when trust was shattered. It is the moment that set the stage for the legal battle to come, and for the lives that would be forever altered. In the days following the crash, the focus shifted from the wreckage on I-96 to the woman who had been behind the wheel. Angela Fitzgerald, 45 years old and a resident of Grand Rapids, was no longer seen simply as a bus driver. She became the central figure in a case that raised questions about responsibility, negligence, and the fragile trust between parents, schools, and those tasked with transporting children. Her initial statements to deputies painted a picture of someone who believed she had done nothing wrong. She insisted she had not consumed alcohol in months. She admitted to taking Ativan the night before, a prescription medication often used to treat anxiety, but claimed she was fit to drive. Ativan alone might have explained drowsiness or slowed reflexes, but toxicology reports revealed something more troubling. THC, the active ingredient in marijuana, was present in her system at the time of the crash. That finding transformed the narrative. It was no longer just about a driver who may have been tired. It was about a driver who was impaired. By August 2025, Fitzgerald was arraigned in Ionia County District Court. She faced 8 charges, including 2 felony counts of operating while intoxicated causing serious injury. Released on a $5,000 bond, she returned home, but the legal battle was only beginning. Prosecutors continued to gather evidence, and as new medical reports surfaced, the scope of the case widened. Another student's injuries were classified as serious, and the charges expanded. Fitzgerald now faced 10 counts. 3 felony charges of operating while intoxicated causing serious injury, 3 counts of operating while intoxicated with minors on board, 1 count of operating while intoxicated, and 3 counts of moving violations causing serious impairment of body function. Each charge represented more than a line in a legal document. They represented the pain of students, the anguish of families, and the betrayal of trust. Parents had believed their children were safe. Schools had believed their transportation provider was reliable. Fitzgerald's impairment shattered those beliefs. Her name became synonymous with negligence. Her actions a cautionary tale of what happens when responsibility is abandoned. The public reaction was swift and unforgiving. News of the toxicology results spread quickly, fueling outrage. Parents demanded answers. Communities questioned how drivers were screened, whether drug testing was rigorous enough, and whether schools were doing enough to protect children. The case became a symbol of accountability, a reminder that safety protocols must be more than words on paper. For Fitzgerald, the scrutiny was relentless. Every detail of her life was examined. Her toxicology results became headlines. Her arraignment was reported widely. The expanded charges underscored the seriousness of her situation. She was no longer viewed as a driver who had made a mistake. She was seen as the embodiment of negligence, the person whose choices had left children injured and one permanently disabled. Behind the legal proceedings were human stories. One student had lost part of their foot, a permanent disability that would shape the rest of their life. Others bore scars, both physical and emotional. Families faced medical bills, therapy sessions, and the haunting memory of that day. For Fitzgerald, the consequences were not only legal but moral. She carried the burden of knowing her decisions had changed lives forever. By the end of 2025, Fitzgerald's case had become one of the most closely watched in Michigan. The charges were serious, the evidence damning, and the potential consequences severe. She faced years in prison if convicted. The trial loomed, promising to be a battle of evidence, arguments, and emotions. Yet even before a verdict was reached, the case had already left its mark. It had changed the way parents viewed school trips. It had raised questions about drug testing and driver accountability. It had reminded communities that safety is fragile, that trust can be broken, and that negligence can have devastating consequences. Angela Fitzgerald was no longer just a driver. She was a driver under the microscope, the woman whose choices had turned a school trip into a nightmare, the defendant in a case that would define her future and haunt her forever. The crash on I-96 had already left its mark on the students, their families, and the community. But in the months that followed, the tragedy shifted from the highway to the courtroom. What began as a horrific accident was now being dissected in legal proceedings, where every detail of Angela Fitzgerald's actions would be scrutinized, every toxicology report examined, and every injury weighed against the law. The legal battle was not just about accountability. It was about justice for the victims and the broader question of how society protects its children. Angela Fitzgerald's arraignment in August 2025 marked the beginning of this chapter. Standing before a judge in Ionia County District Court, she faced 8 charges, including 2 felony counts of operating while intoxicated causing serious injury. The charges reflected the seriousness of the crash and the evidence of impairment. Released on a $5,000 bond, Fitzgerald returned home, but the courtroom doors had opened to a process that would define her future. For the families of the injured students, the arraignment was both a step toward justice and a painful reminder of what had been lost. The prosecution's case was built on toxicology results and eyewitness accounts. Fitzgerald had admitted to taking Ativan the night before, a medication known to cause drowsiness and impair coordination. More damning was the presence of THC in her system, the active ingredient in marijuana. Prosecutors argued that this combination left her unfit to drive, and that her impairment directly caused a crash. They emphasized the severity of the injuries, particularly the amputation suffered by one student, as evidence of the devastating consequences of her negligence. Defense attorneys sought to counter this narrative. They argued that Fitzgerald had not consumed alcohol, that she had taken her medication responsibly, and that the crash was a tragic accident rather than criminal negligence. They questioned whether the presence of THC necessarily meant impairment at the time of the crash, pointing to the complexities of toxicology and the difficulty of proving exact levels of influence. Their strategy was to cast doubt, to suggest that while the crash was tragic, it did not rise to the level of criminal culpability. But the prosecution's case grew stronger as new medical reports surfaced. In September 2025, prosecutors announced that another student's injuries had been classified as serious, expanding the scope of the case. Fitzgerald now faced 10 charges. 3 counts of operating while intoxicated causing serious injury, 3 counts of operating while intoxicated with minors on board, 1 count of operating while intoxicated, and 3 counts of moving violations causing serious impairment of body function. The escalation underscored the gravity of the situation. What had begun as 8 charges was now 10, with 6 felonies and 4 misdemeanors. Each charge represented not just a legal accusation, but a human story, a student injured, a family traumatized, a community betrayed. The courtroom became a stage where these stories were told. Parents testified about the anguish of waiting in hospital corridors, about the fear of seeing their children injured, about the anger of knowing the crash could have been prevented. Students spoke about the pain of recovery, the loss of mobility, the emotional scars that lingered long after the physical wounds began to heal. Their voices added weight to the prosecution's case, reminding everyone that this was not just about legal definitions, but about real lives forever changed. The legal battle was also a public spectacle. News outlets covered each development, from the arraignment to the expanded charges. Headlines emphasized the presence of THC, the severity of the injuries, and the growing list of accusations. The case became a symbol of accountability, a reminder that impaired driving is not just a personal choice, but a public danger. Communities debated the adequacy of drug testing for drivers, the responsibility of schools in vetting transportation providers, and the broader issue of how to ensure safety on school trips. For Fitzgerald, the weight of the charges was crushing. She faced the possibility of years in prison, if convicted. Her defense team worked to mitigate the damage, but the evidence was overwhelming. The toxicology reports, the admissions about Ativan, the expanded charges, the testimonies of victims and families. Together, they painted a picture of negligence that was difficult to refute. Fitzgerald's future hung in the balance, her fate to be decided not by the crash itself, but by the courtroom proceedings that followed. The legal battle was not just about Fitzgerald. It was about the victims, their families, and the community. It was about the broader question of how society responds to negligence, how it holds individuals accountable, and how it seeks justice for those who have been harmed. It was about the fragile line between safety and disaster and the responsibility of those entrusted with protecting others. The courtroom became the place where these questions were asked, where evidence was weighed, and where justice was pursued. By the end of 2025, the trial had not yet concluded. Sentencing had not yet occurred. But the legal battle had already left its mark. It had changed the way parents viewed school trips. It had raised questions about drug testing and driver accountability. It had reminded communities that safety is fragile, that trust can be broken, and that negligence can have devastating consequences. The case of Angela Fitzgerald was no longer just about a crash on I-96. It was about the pursuit of justice, the demand for accountability, and the enduring impact of a tragedy that should never have happened. The crash on I-96 was more than a violent collision of steel and asphalt. It was a rupture in the lives of young people who had boarded a bus with dreams of college and futures waiting to unfold. In the days and months that followed, the story shifted from the wreckage to human cost, a cost measured not only in broken bones and amputations, but in the invisible scars of trauma, fear, and lost innocence. One student's life was permanently altered when doctors made the agonizing decision to amputate part of their foot. For a teenager, the loss was not just physical, but deeply emotional. The dreams of dancing, performing, or simply walking without pain were suddenly replaced by the reality of prosthetics, rehabilitation, and the constant reminder of what had been taken away. The amputation became a symbol of the crash's brutality, a visible marker of negligence that could never be erased. Other students bore injuries that, while less visible, were no less profound. Broken bones healed, but the memory of being thrown against seats, of hearing the screams of friends, of feeling the bus slam into the guardrail lingered. Trauma does not fade with time. It embeds itself in the mind, resurfacing in quiet moments, in nightmares, in the sudden grip of fear when stepping onto another bus. For these students, the crash was not a single event, but an ongoing reality, shaping their sense of safety and trust. Parents carried their own scars. The phone calls that shattered their day, the frantic rush to hospitals, the sight of their children in pain. These experiences left wounds that no courtroom verdict could heal. They had trusted the system, trusted the adults, trusted the promise that school trips were safe. That trust was broken, replaced by anger, grief, and a relentless demand for accountability. For many, the crash was not just about their own child, but about the broader question of how society protects its most vulnerable. The community, too, was changed. The Grand Rapids Civic Theatre, once a place of creativity and joy, now carried the shadow of tragedy. The crash became a cautionary tale, a reminder that negligence can infiltrate even the most innocent of activities. Conversations shifted from rehearsals and performances to safety protocols and drug testing. The case forced schools, parents, and transportation providers to confront uncomfortable truths: that safety is fragile, that oversight can fail, and that the consequences of impairment are devastating. Angela Fitzgerald's life was also irrevocably altered. She faced not only the weight of legal charges, but the burden of knowing her actions had left children injured and one permanently disabled. Her name became synonymous with negligence, her case a symbol of accountability. Whether she intended harm or believed she was fit to drive, the reality was undeniable. Her decisions had changed lives forever. The courtroom would decide her fate, but the verdict of public opinion had already been delivered. The crash sparked broader debates about policy and prevention. Should charter bus drivers be subject to stricter drug testing? Should schools demand more rigorous screening before hiring transportation providers? How can communities ensure that children are truly safe when they board a bus for a field trip? These questions extended beyond Michigan, resonating with parents and educators across the country. The case became a catalyst for change, a reminder that safety protocols must be more than words on paper. Yet, for the victims and their families, policy debates offered little comfort. Their lives have been altered in ways that no legislation could undo. The student who lost part of their foot faced a lifetime of adjustments, of learning to navigate a world that had suddenly become more difficult. Other students carried the weight of trauma, their sense of safety shattered. Parents bore the burden of grief and anger, their trust broken. The community carried the shadow of tragedy, its innocence lost. The story of Angela Fitzgerald's case is not just about a crash or a courtroom. It is about lives forever changed, about the fragility of trust, about the devastating consequences of negligence. It is about the students who boarded a bus with dreams and stepped off with scars. It is about the parents who waved goodbye with reassurance and rushed to hospitals with fear. It is about a community forced to confront the reality that safety is never guaranteed. The crash on I-96 will be remembered not just for its violence, but for its impact. It will be remembered as the day innocence was shattered, as the day trust was broken, as the day lives were forever changed. And it will serve as a reminder, long after courtroom doors close, that responsibility matters, that negligence has consequences, and that the cost of impaired driving is measured not in statistics, but in human lives.